Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Amsterdam. I'm afraid I don't have a particularly nice background for you today, but I'm noticing in the mirror, not only do you get to see the fact that I'm packing my luggage and getting ready to come back to the States, but you get a little view reflected out the window onto the beautiful Amsterdam street scene. I am sorry that I'm unable to come to you live today, but my plane, it turns out, is exactly departing when I would be starting today's talk with you guys. So the show must go on, and Amy and Genevieve generously agreed to let me do this recorded for you, and so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I think today will be the last of this series that we've been doing on building a better economy. And so let me just get things set up real quickly for you. And I think they're good to go now. I'm going to try to indicate to you a variety of ideas that are concrete reform ideas, but also ideas about repairing democracy itself, the institutions that would be necessary in order to re-regulate the economy. And part of the suggestion here is that we've lost the capacity, the power, the civic solidarity, the trust in government to do this well. So we can't just build new governmental capacity. We need, I'm sorry, we have to build new governmental capacity in addition to democratizing the economy. That's the big takeaway from this lecture series. We've talked together, and I'm just going to refresh memory very quickly about the way in which over the last 40 years the state and the law have really been taken over by private interest, and how this has allowed for the accumulation of vast fortunes, a new gilded age, and new levels of inequality that are just staggering, and the mistrust and discontent, the grievance that has resulted as so many people's expectations of kind of secure middle class prospects have been shattered, as economic mobility has essentially been removed for half of the population. We've also talked about just last week together what this does to a democracy, and just to summarize ever so briefly, right? Two diagrams that I think really bring this home. That perhaps the United States is really better described as an oligarchy than as a democracy. That on the one hand, there really is no political responsiveness on the part of our elected officials to average persons, but there is real responsiveness to both the top 10% and to interest groups. And then you add to that the level of campaign funding by the top 0.01%, right? 40% of the money spent in American politics in recent years. And it becomes absolutely clear, right, that the reason our politics is not responsive to average citizens is because it's essentially not funded by them. That has all of the hallmarks of an oligarchy. Power has been purchased by the hyper wealthy. I've shown you this diagram multiple times before. Today, I want to emphasize one thing, right? We're in an economy where basically half the population lives on a income that puts them very close to the poverty level, that makes them very precarious, that this has coincided with tremendous generation of wealth, but it is skewed in its distribution so that a large portion of income and wealth are going to the very, very, very wealthy, the top 0.01%, the top 1%, the top 10%, that's the broadest group. And even that group is basically just seeing its income increase at the rate of the overall economy. This is resulting in many people, not just being economically insecure, but really having their entire sense of social belonging threatened. And one measure of that, one reflection or echo of that, is the rise in deaths of despair and this epidemic of deaths of despair that we've had in this country for the last 20 years. I want to return you to what I think of as a really powerful sociological generalization in thinking about this data for the last time in this series. And that is this equation at the bottom of the header for the diagram here. Scarcity generates competition, generates scarcity. And the idea here, right, is if you live in a social world in which the goods that you require are not available in a sufficient supply, many people will naturally try to do what they can to hoard or to secure for themselves those goods, right? And those resources which are essential to survival or to social standing or security. If we compete for them, right, we are much less likely to cooperate in securing a sufficient share of them for everyone. And so competition, as opposed to cooperation, tends to further scarcity, right? So scarcity generates competition, competition generates scarcity, and then we're in one of those feedback loops, those self-reinforcing cycles in which something bad causes something else bad, reinforces the original cause, and we tend to spiral into greater and greater inequality. And this is the situation that seems to me to have transpired in the United States and in its economy over the last 40 years. This is what we're seeking to address. And I just wanted to add scarcity generates competition, which reinforces scarcity, to get a sense of the way in which you can get locked in to this dynamic, and then how difficult it can be to escape. This was the new idea I introduced last week, and the core idea here is that in the 21st century, probably really for much of democratic history, but certainly after the first industrial revolution in the middle of the 19th century, it has no longer been the case that we can assume that democracy will simply be met halfway, greeted by friendly and hospitable social circumstances in the economy, especially, but also in the organization of the public sphere, in perhaps the organization of civil society as well. And so, whereas the ideas that gave rise to the American Revolution and many of the early democratic revolutions and constitutions assumed what we have to do is organize the state democratically, and then people will want to take advantage of the opportunities that a democratically organized state affords. And on the other hand, that society is not going to be per se hostile to democracy. Already in the last third of the 19th century, many progressive and populist activists had begun to mistrust that faith in the idea of society basically being benign, so that all that was important was getting the political rights and institutions as democratic as possible. If you look at, and here I'm going to highlight John Dewey and Louis Brandeis, but a whole string of progressive reformers in the late 19th, early 20th century, what they're saying is this is no longer the case. And so democracy has to take on an additional task, and that is actually legislating to regulate the economy and to regulate other aspects of the social environment. For instance, to create public schools so that you have an educated citizenry, or to offer support for unions or for public spaces like the parks that we see in so many states and cities, right? Central Park in New York City, Golden Gate Park in San Francisco were part of a movement to create public space for average citizens in an appreciation of the democratic potential of allowing people to freely congregate in space that was no longer being created spontaneously by society, right? And so I've suggested two different models for democratic efforts to secure a socially hospitable environment. One of them, democratic self-protection. And this is recognizing that society is likely to change or contain forces that are hostile to democracy. And so the intact, strong democracy needs to not only preserve its central institutional structure, but also be wary of what's happening in the broader social environment. And one way to read what's happened in the last 40, 50 years in many democracies is we have neglected the project of democratic self-protection. And that puts us then in the realm of democratic self-repair, where not only does democracy, in order to preserve itself, in order to protect itself, need to work not only to make sure that its central institutions are functioning, that, for instance, its representatives are actually responsive to the desires, interests, preferences of the majority of its members, but also that the economy is not accumulating so much wealth and power in so few hands that it's bound to subvert democracy, right? That's the focus for these lectures, but that just illustrates one way in which democracy may be eroded by a hostile social environment. Once it's neglected the task of securing a more hospitable social environment, it tends itself to be, democracy tends to be damaged, right? And I've shown you a bunch of evidence. I'll review it very briefly, that our democracy is damaged, and that it's damaged because we have neglected democratic self-protection for at least 40 years. And so we're really much more in the democratic self-repair box on this diagram than in the self-protection. And that's a still more difficult project, because you have to simultaneously try to rebuild democratic capacities and responsiveness while also trying to address the hostility of the social world to the democratic institutions you're trying to repair, right? And so you have to do two at once, and you have to do them from a place in which democracy is already damaged, is already weakened. And so that is the moment we're in, and that is the particular difficulty we face. Last week, I shared with you my list of 19 ways in which democracy is damaged. Today, I will just reintroduce you, I should say, to the 8 categories of democratic damage that I've constructed, and I don't claim any originality for this. This is really just pulling together a bunch of stuff we've talked about before and that is very much out there in the literature. Source number one, there are multiple sources of reactionary authoritarian impulses in the world today, including in democratic societies. And as we are seeing, this is destabilizing democracy in many places, the world leading to democratic backsliding in the democratic world. These authoritarian impulses are being articulated in partisan politics by political parties that are increasingly moving in the direction of illiberal populism, attacking the rights that protect minorities, attacking members of the minorities themselves, attacking democratic institutions when the democratic institutions don't favor the illiberal populace. The third big category here, erosion of democratic norms. This tends to happen when a party turns against democracy or hedges, makes its support for democracy contingent upon winning power, right? Obviously, we saw this in the United States in the aftermath of the 2020 election. A decay of the infrastructure of democracy. And here I'm not paying as much attention to elections and parties so much as civil society, broad-based organizations that allow people to come together, political participation on the part of average people, as opposed to elites capturing institutions. And again, I think we're seeing across the board in the democratic world a decline in the health of the infrastructure of democracy, a deformed public sphere. This hardly needs mentioning, but mistruth circulates widely, easily, readily, and far too often is very difficult to differentiate from what is true or credible or verified. Algorithmically amplified affect, right? We live in a world where so many of us spend so much time on our devices, and as we do, we are on social media, and the social media are engineered, right? Millions upon millions of dollars have been spent to get our attention captured by them. One of the best ways to do that is to play on rage or anxiety or grievance, on these raw emotions that then, having been amplified, they don't just recede when we come off the device, right? And frequently what we're looking at on the device is stuff about the real world, trying to tell us that there's some conspiracy to rob our power, to overturn the results of the election, et cetera. And so this makes us far more receptive to the illiberal populism, or simply to the partisan polarization and mistrust that animates our politics. State structure that is distorted by drift, right? And so here the suggestion is, right, especially in the United States, still working with an 18th century constitution, but in many societies that don't have sufficiently responsive mechanisms to update their constitutions as social circumstances change, we end up trying to work in the Procrustean bed of our old constitution as new social problems arise. And as I'll talk about a fair bit today, in the United States, that's meant the rapid growth of an administrative state. And I'll say more about this in a few minutes, but a whole vast array of administrative agencies created by Congress, but associated with the executive, that really don't have a clear or comfortable place constitutionally speaking, and do not have a democratically articulated structure, and so mechanisms of accountability. Finally, and obviously, globalization has meant that so much of the power, so much of what influences us escapes the boundaries of the nation state, yet democracy tends to be organized at the level of the nation state. So all of that has then pushed political parties in the direction of illiberal populism, ethno-national authoritarianism, mistrust, disinformation, and obviously we are seeing that, have seen that in this country, especially in the aftermath of the 2020 election. All of this partisan animosity making it really hard for us to come together. All of this attraction to authoritarian leaders, willingness to mistrust and even try to overturn elections. So I want to concentrate today on policy. And again, I've assembled a list here, And I'm not going to go through everything on the list. What I want to do is try to exemplify the basic approach that I want to take. And the approach actually, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go forward a little bit because I'm not seeing here it is. I'm not sure. I guess I thought I would want to talk about this later, but I want to talk about it right now. Um, the what I'm calling the guideposts for a democratic political economy, and the reason I want to start here is I want to talk about values before talking about policies, and I suspect that most of the policies that I'm going to discuss with you might, in fact, if implemented and allowed to take hold, to actually work over, say, a decade, become incredibly popular policies. The way that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid today have become the third rail of American politics. You can't touch them, right? I suspect that many of the policies that I'm going to discuss with you would have similar capacity to build their own constituency of support. They would be broad-based, their benefits would be clear for many Americans. But having said that, the problem is not, getting them passed and waiting a decade and seeing if they gather support. It's getting them passed, right? And in America, in the middle of the 2020s, it's very hard to imagine a new deal, or what I've called in the past a re-new deal, right? It's hard to imagine people generating the degree of consensus required to actually undertake new and ambitious policies. In the original New Deal, this was done primarily on a partisan basis, but the Democrats had so much power, such a super majority in Congress, the presidency, eventually the Supreme Court got out of the way, and they were able to um, enact that whole raft of reforms pretty much on a partisan basis. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And so, what we really need to be thinking about in the 2020s, if we're going to start doing the really hard work of democratic self repair, is what the values are that ground the case for this legislation, and whether or not there isn't more of an implicit consensus on key democratic values despite our partisan polarization. And I'll just suggest briefly that there is some pretty good evidence that Americans do agree on something like the values that I'm listing here. The problem is, of course, if they are articulated by one side of the partisan divide and one side only, that they immediately become subject to the polarizing dynamics of our politics. So we have a problem here. My suggestion is focusing on the values is the perhaps only path open to us to imagining a way out of this. I don't think we're going to get to the place again in contemporary American politics where one party is going to have sufficient power to enact a really transformational reformist agenda on its own. So very quickly, non-domination, right? And so nobody should get the power to be able to control the fate, the life, the politics of other people. That means one of the things we want from our state is to prevent large accumulations of power. And obviously the degree of concentration of wealth represents such a threat to political equality. democratic sovereignty over the basic structure of the political economy. We want some say. Is there going to be affordable housing? Is there going to be basic economic security? How many hours are we going to have to work each week to get that economic security? Society without systematic status subordination, here I'm thinking of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, national background, the kind of standard um, identity categories that have become the basis for status and caste-like systems in 21st century democratic societies. We obviously have to eliminate that. No excessive social inequality. And I've tried to argue with you in the past that there's a really powerful raft of evidence suggesting that more equal developed societies are happier societies, are healthier societies, are societies that have better educational outcomes, life expectancies, et cetera. That inequality in and of itself, if it becomes too extreme, is destructive of the levels of trust, cooperation, well-being, and solidarity that democracy relies on. Probably we need good jobs for everybody who wants them, basic economic security and meaningful economic opportunity, an environmentally sustainable economy, global economic control and justice. In a global economy, we need to have the wherewithal to control what goes on within our own border, and also some sense that although we're buying stuff from all over the world, we're not buying stuff that involves slave labor or other forms of human rights violation or degradation. And so then with that set of values in mind, I think we can go back to the legislation that I'm going to talk about for a moment. Again, please note that this is a detailed policy wonk list, a kind of progressive dream wish list, if you will. And I'm just going to focus on a few categories to illustrate this, but I want to try also to highlight one main point as we start this discussion, which is this is not just new policies, right? We do need new policies, there's no doubt about it, but it is also new ways of organizing democratic power to make it effective in protecting democracy from a more hostile social environment. And that involves new ways of organizing democratic power, including new ways of organizing the state. So this is not just a list of a bunch of substantive policy aims, it's also an agenda for reworking the democratic state, especially the administrative state. So the arc of policy over the last 100 years, I've argued with you, has been from a kind of policy that is indifferent to inequality to a much more egalitarian policy and back. And we have to keep that in mind as the broad arc of American policy as reflected in the progressivity of federal income tax or the level of federal tax rates. I've suggested to you that the neoliberal economic era from 1980 to the present really dismantled much that was equality promoting in our federal legislation, that I am convinced, at least in one respect, by Robert Putnam's very thorough, well-researched, innovative account of where the egalitarian success of the middle of the 20th century came from. And his claim is that it didn't come from politics alone, that it didn't come from economics alone, that changes in society and culture the degree to which we came together in civil society, the degree to which we constructed a culture of solidarity, allowed us in politics to become more cooperative and compassionate, allowed us in economics to become more egalitarian and cooperative as well. And that if we are going to repeat the success of the middle of the 20th century, we need to be thinking along the same lines. It's another reason to start with the values. The values are not just values to guide public policy. That is one really important thing we do with them, but they are also values to guide the creation of civil society organizations, the construction of a more solidaristic culture. And so not just asking our politicians to act on those values, but acting on those values here and now, you and I, in the location that we find ourselves with the power that we happen to have at our disposal. That is something, again, that seems to have been crowded out of contemporary life or defeated by the degree of partisan rancor and disillusion in our society. And so getting back to core values in order to become active along multiple fronts. Having said that, I also suggested to you, and again, I'm reviewing a lot today to build to the end of this set of connected lectures, that we need to take a very careful look at the New Deal. We can't just hold it up. We did it with complete success in the middle of the 20th century. Too bad we took our foot off the gas in the last 20 years of the 20th century, and then everything fell apart. That there were internal limits to the New Deal, right? As these scholars suggest, that some of those limits have to do with the fact that African Americans and women, other key categories, were excluded from its benefits. Some of it have to do with the fact that it was a period of extraordinary economic growth that we can't take for granted ever occurring again, but a fair bit of it has to do with the state mechanisms that were used to implement this policy. And just to review quickly, right, that the idea of relying on insulated experts who were managers who only had to look for a few bad apples. They were mainly fine-tuning the economy as opposed to being more deeply concerned about the potential for inequality in the economy. And I think part of this does reflect the culture of the middle of the 20th century. There was much greater solidarity and trust in each other. Give the power to the experts, and of course, they will do what is in the public good. And so will the corporate elite, that as long as it's not a bad apple, and that bad apple will be caught by our regulators. That worked reasonably well for 20 or 30 years, right? But in the end, it broke down. And I think that it was quite predictable that it would break down. It was inherently limited in terms of its capacity, right? It needed information from the outside. Where was the managerial elite of the administrative state going to get the information it needed? It had to turn to the industries that it was regulating to get that information. That is a kind of, right, fox in the hen house scenario. How long do you think it's going to last that those industries are just going to provide reliable information, as opposed to trying to influence the regulators to regulate in ways that favor their industry over the competition, or favor their industry over the consumer or the public, right? And so we end up with capture of the administrative state in many realms, with those who are supposed to be regulated actually having undue influence over the regulatory apparatus, the interests that the regulatory apparatus is supposed to serve, the consumer or the middle class or average person or the public, no longer being the interests served. So these are intrinsic limits to the New Deal, limits that were perhaps camouflaged or slow to become explicit after having at first been latent, but eventually they did come to the fore. And in a sense, then I think there are two different stories to tell about the decline of the New Deal. One of them is that it got overwhelmed from the outside by neoliberalism, by Reagan and Thatcher, and a whole then generation of politicians who explored an alternative approach that's landed us in this place of deep inequality and precariousness we're in now. Or alternatively, a second explanation, these are not mutually exclusive, that the New Deal actually succumbed to its own internal faults and limits. And having drawn that lesson, then we can note, right, that there are some really good proposals for rebuilding administrative capacity that rely less on expertise, less on managerialism, less on fine tuning. And if I then have to mention the alternative, it is opening the administrative state as a space of democratic accountability directly in the 21st century, creating administrative structures that allow ordinary people to have inputs into what the regulations are going to be and how they're going to be enforced. And so using democratic power over the economy via democratic agency through the administrative state is, I think, that the cord that connects all of these policy proposals. So to explain this for a minute, I need to talk through why we've got such a large and complex administrative state in the 21st century. And here, really, we're talking about developments that go back to the middle of the 20th century, the New Deal, and the explosion of administrative agencies under Roosevelt and Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, right? You know, it's a bipartisan affair in the second half of the 20th century. And Congress is really important in this, in the sense that Congress determines that they need a more activist state, more regulation of the economy. They begin to do the work of democratic self-protection, but because what they're trying to accomplish is the regulation of a dynamic, quickly changing, evolving economy, they don't think they can legislate in a way, pass new laws that keep up with the rate of change in the economy. They need a more nimble, more responsive form of political agency that is well calibrated to what it's trying to regulate, a dynamic economy. And so, as opposed to passing law after law after law after law, what they do is they create these administrative agencies and they give them broad mandates, right? The Clean Air and Clean Water Acts make sure that industries don't put anything harmful into our water and air that could cause long-term health impacts, right? And then it's up to the agency to figure out, well, what do we need to do for coal-fired power plants? What do we need to do for natural gas power plants? What do we need to do for nuclear power plants? And so the agency ends up writing the details of the regulations, updating them themselves in order to meet the broad mandate that's been given to it by Congress. This became especially important as we moved into a period of partisan parity in the late 20th century, where the two parties essentially uh, alternated control of Congress. Neither one had long-term stable control of Congress. And the result of that was that legislating became really hard. And so get the regulations right once, give it to the regulatory agency in the administrative state, it will do the work. And the result of this has been, on the one hand, some genuine success. And I don't want to just say, get rid of the administrative state. I think that would be a huge mistake. We are absolutely reliant on it for consumer health and safety regulation, for occupational health and safety regulation, for vehicle regulation, for airline regulation, for food supply regulation, for medicine regulation. We are in a much safer world as a result of the growth of the regulatory state, but the regulatory state is not working as well as it needs to be, as it needs to perform those key consumer and public protection functions. And it's not working nearly well enough to do the really important work of democratic self-protection and self-repair. And so we need to rethink the administrative state away from the managerial expertise insulated model. Think here of the Federal Reserve. As I've said in the past, you appoint the experts and then you can't remove them from office. They are insulated from political accountability. And it is absolutely true that you don't want the Federal Reserve to be the plaything of electoral politics. But having said that, when the entire administrative state is set up to be insulated from political input, you have a vast opportunity for capture by the interests they're meant to be regulating, and a really incredibly powerful, perhaps the most productive or capacious aspect of contemporary American politics, insulated from democratic input. And so many people rightly feel that their vote doesn't matter in the arena where most of the action is. And so how do we re-democratize the administrative state? And I want to suggest this is not just a problem for people like me who want to figure out what to do about democratic self-protection and repair in the 21st century, or how to democratize part of the state that is currently experiencing a serious democratic deficit. It's a problem if we want to maintain the administrative state, because I think it is absolutely clear that it is in the crosshairs of the arch conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court right now. We had West Virginia versus the EPA in the 2022 Supreme Court session, in which they essentially indicated very clearly that they did not like the EPA's broad mandate under the Clean Air Act, that they wanted the Congress to give them much more specific authorization. If this becomes precedent, if they begin revisiting a whole bunch of other statutes that authorize a whole bunch of other regulation, they may slowly but surely dismantle the administrative state. And so what we have to do, I think, in looking at this is not just say, oh my God, it's an arch conservative Supreme Court, we have to protect ourselves from them. It means we have to get new members of the Supreme Court. Good luck. I think we have to ask, wait, is there actually a kernel of truth in what this conservative Supreme Court is saying, which is that the administrative state was not envisioned by our Constitution, and Congress is delegating to the executive power that there is not really a constitutional authorization to delegate, and without establishing adequate means for ongoing accountability, input, responsiveness there's a democratic deficit in the administrative state, and that may be true even if we don't like the idea of it being dismantled. So I think we need to revisit the administrative state in the 21st century and need to figure out how we can generate power and capacity to regulate a complex and recalcitrant economy. Sorry, I think you heard somebody knocking at the door, but they went away. And to do so in ways, I've got to check out of here in 20 minutes, do so in ways that give power to the people and are not easily captured, not to managerial experts and elites. And so I've called your attention already to K. Sabeel Rahman, who is working in the Biden administration right now, a law professor in Brooklyn, and his book, Democracy Against Domination, which I like a lot. He has some really interesting proposals for doing this. And this is where I will conclude today. His proposals involve really deeply restructuring the administrative state and doing so in ways that don't just invite public comment, but really open the administrative state to ongoing democratic input. So make it part of the design of the agency that there has to be broad-based input before it implements or updates a regulation. Create lots of opportunities, online forum, in-person meetings, and dispersed throughout the country for regular people to come in and say what they need from food safety or air quality or water quality regulations, right? And recognize the tendency to administrative capture by powerful social interests, and then do things to amplify ordinary people's power to influence the regulations by legislating responsiveness, balance, opportunity, not allowing capture to occur, and then using the administrative state capacity to do things that, frankly, we haven't done for the last 40 years. And here I'll just focus on two very quickly: bringing oversight to key economic actors, banks and other financial institutions, housing construction firms, and the real estate industry, the places that the widespread sense of vulnerability, precariousness, unfairness in our economy are coming from. Those are the actors that most need regulating. And frankly, those are the aspects of the regulatory state that we have dismantled aggressively over the last 40 years. Reapply public scrutiny and authority to those key financial and other institutions, but do so with a reinvigorated, democratized administrative state that allows open opportunity, creates targets for ordinary people to be involved in advising the regulators about how to regulate. Finally, taking an antitrust and public utility approach to break up the too big to fail actors. And again, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. We're in an era of bank failure right now. I think there's a lot of public attention focused on it. We're in an era where banks are failing and again being bailed out, right? And so not paying the cost of their perhaps irresponsible actions. Building on the opportunity that this crisis represents to say, wait, why are we bailing out the banks, right? We're bailing out the banks because they're too big to fail, because they are systemically important. But these are mid-level regional banks. These are not giant banks. Why are these banks too big to fail? Well, because of, on the one hand, the fact that they have become big enough, right? And on the other hand, because of this fear of contagion, of spread, of confidence being eroded, and recognizing that in the 21st century, we live in a economy that is so interconnected that even mid-sized economic actors can become systemically important, and we need to regulate them, to break them up, or to treat them as public utilities so that they don't take risks that are frankly being backed implicitly by the public, because they know if they end up insolvent, the government will have to bail them out, right? And so using either antitrust, anti-monopoly regulation to really break them up, or else saying, wait, this is really a public utility. This is a public service. And as such, maybe we do require quasi-monopolies, but then they have to be hyper-regulated and in ways that are not just turned over to experts, but allow for democratic input. All right, everybody. I'm sorry, I've got to go because they're knocking on the door. It has been almost an hour. I will open next week's session with an opportunity for you to ask questions, give comments on this week, and we will be back together live to continue the conversation next week. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.